Hello and welcome to Unacademy. I welcome you all to this session. We will be discussing 8 to 9 important articles out of the Hindu newspaper today. And there are important announcements for you. The day is here. Conquer Prelims is going to start today. So before we begin, as always, the offer in which you're going to use the IS English code through which you will get 50% off plus 6 months free extension is going to end very soon. So please do use this opportunity to join us and become a part of our family. Remember, use the code IS English. If you don't, you will not be attributed to our team and the mentorship sessions will go to the other teams. You need English mentorship and a guided program. Further, today is the date. Chetan sir is going to today take the first session on IR at 7 p.m. So do join us at 7 p.m. Like, share and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any of these sessions. From today till 24th of February, we will have sessions based on the concept of IR, then economics, then geography, then history, then the concept of government schemes and social issues, and science and technology, including polity and Sarmat sir. So do remember, this starts today. Stage 2 of Conquer Prelims starts today. Now, you will get the PPT of this session in this Telegram channel. Just scan this QR code and you'll get access to it. Now let's look at the 8 interesting articles we're going to cover today. The first one is the budget. The first 2 rather are related to the budget, which is what does the budget have to say about the railways and what does the budget have to say about urban development. 2 very important sectors of the economy and of our country itself. What are these 2 allocated in the budget? It's a very interesting article because the first one has been written by a person who is actually involved in the Vande Bharat project, and the second one by a person who was involved in the what we call as urban local bodies and is also an ex-mayor. Don't have a lot to good to say, but we'll discuss that. Then we'll talk about an AI Action Summit which is happening today in Paris. What are the issues which India should flag? Then we'll talk about a very interesting concept of how Trump is basically digging his own hole, because we will talk about the import data of China and what we call the US. How much does the US import from China? Very interesting point. Then finally, we have the resignation of the Manipur CM after a proper humanitarian crisis because of the violence which has been happening. Thereafter, we will move to a very interesting move by the government just before the Prime Minister is going to Paris and the US. And we'll end with something which is happening in this city itself, which is Bangalore, where the Aero show is going to start. And we will discuss why Aero India is so important. What are the aspects related to that? 2 very interesting fighters have come together, which very unlikely come together, which is Su-57 and F-35. Both are going to take part. A Russian and American 5th generation fighter together is a very rare spectacle. Okay, good morning to all of you. I hope all of you are on the same page with me. Let's start. Now let's talk about this article, which is what does the budget have to offer for the railways. Now, if you remember, if you have been connected to the UPSC sector or you've been reading newspaper, you would know that the railway budget used to come 2 to 3 days before the budget, and it used to be a spectacle in itself. And then the budget used to come. However, since 2017, this concept has been stopped where the railway budget and the budget were separately presented. Rather, now the railway budget is integrated into the budget itself, and there is no shosha with regards to how we talk about the railways. Now, interestingly, this year, there was no passing reference to the railway allocation, to the railway budget, to the railway issues, meaning whatever we know about the railway budget is coming from the Minister of Railways itself, and by reading the, you can say, budget in a closed manner. Previously, what we used to see was there was a lot of highlighted aspects of the railways which was talked about in the public sphere, but now that has not been done, and there may be reasons for that, why there was no mention of the railway budget in that regard. Though a very big allocation happens to it, we are still, the government was at least silent with regards to the budgetary speech about the railways. Now, railways is the lifeline of India. You like it, you don't like it. The idea is because it is publicly funded, it is at the rate it is, it does not have the revenue to actually meet its operational cost. And there's a lot which is happening as of today. So therefore, there is one lobby which says that the railway should be privatized, such as in America, and the other lobby which says that the system which we have is, which is a hybridish model wherein the 99% of the money is allocated by the government itself, but there is some form of outreach with regards to the private sector. There is one more set of people who say that fully subsidized 100% funded railway makes sense, but railway is in that spectrum where the government allocation of money is extremely important rather than the privately funded, and that is why in America privately funded trains and the cost of travel on trains is extremely high, rather people will take a flight. But railways is bringing in concepts which look like what we call as private sector strategies, such as surge pricing and all, but that's a separate issue altogether. Now, how we look at this is we look at the positives of the budgetary speech or budgetary allocation, we look at the negatives which come out of it, and therefore you will get enough fodder to write a critically analyzed answer. You have both positive and negative for this topic. Now, when we talk about the positives, the Minister of Railways, after the budgetary allocation has come through, has argued that we are moving for infrastructure development in railways. We are going for modernization of stations. We are going for better connectivity, safety and comfort, and new railway lines, along with change of gauge in areas where it makes sense. And we are trying to go for high-speed railways. One pet project is Vande Bharat program, which also has a certain allocation within this money. But again, there is no timeline which has been given for Vande Bharat program. Further, when he said that if we look at the average number of railway tracks added annually, that has gone up from 114 or 113 in 2009-2014 to now 150 kilometers of new track added on an average every day with regards to the fiscal year. Now, this is one data which will help you in giving a good picture of the railways in that regard. Further, they are saying that safety related, because multiple train accidents happened in the past 2 years, safety initiatives have been allocated close to 1 lakh crores. And with regards to electrification, there's also a very interesting concept which has been said. 16 times more we are adding what we call as electrified railways, wherein previously it used to be 18 railway kilometers per year. Now we are electrifying at 294 railway kilometers per year, which is again interesting. He is arguing that we are going to become 100% electrified and one of the greenest railways in the world. Now this has to be contextualized. What do you mean by greenest railways? Because green is a very specific word and has a different type of understanding. So we'll try to understand what does this word green actually mean. So unfortunately, this article only gives you these positives, which is that there is addition at a higher pace, there is electrification 16 times at a higher pace, and there is safety, you can say a certain understanding where the government realizes that the safety in railways is important, wherein the Kavach system comes through. Kavach system is a very important automated train collision system, wherein it anti-train collision system as it is called, wherein it stops two trains on the same track from colliding one another. There is also a lot of technology involved in it, wherein it can have what we call as digital signaling in fog-like conditions. There is the signal available to the loco pilot inside the train itself. Kavach is a very important system, wherein it allows for the station master and the train to connect via digital means, and train-to-train communication is also possible using RFIDs on track itself. The location of the train can be known to the station itself, and therefore it brings in a lot of technology. Kavach is important, but Kavach is also expensive. That is one of the issues with Kavach. It's a very expensive system, one of the, again, pet projects of the railway minister himself. Now, therein lies the positive. Unfortunately, the negative is bigger in this article than positive, and this is where you get critical analysis understanding. So when we start to talk about the negatives, the first issue in this budget is there is no mention of increase in Kavach coverage for 2025-26. Originally, it had been given for this stretch of 1400 kilometers near Secunderabad. Not even 1 kilometer has been added for the concept of Kavach. This is a paradox. Why? Because if you have a budgetary allocation of 1 lakh crores for safety related initiatives and you are not adding even 1 kilometer of Kavach coverage, it is problematic. This means that it is based on some misplaced understanding of what we call as the larger narrative that we will work for safety. But the most important system which is there for safety itself, it has not been given any form of enhancement. So Kavach program actually gets nothing whatsoever or no mention and no increase in coverage. Only 1400 kilometers, 100% Kavach coverage is being talked about. Just putting a Kavach system in a train or which is whatever the locomotive will not do anything. It has to have subsidiary systems with regards to the station also having a subsystem and also the tracks also getting upgraded. So therefore, this is the first major negative which is there. The second negative which is talked about is there's one program which is running within the railways itself. It is called the Amrit Bharat Station Redevelopment Program. Now, under this, Gandhinagar, Habibganj, Cuttack, Ayodhya, Charpali, these stations have been redeveloped. They have been beautified. But in the same system, in the same program, New Delhi railway station also comes through. And unfortunately, one of the busiest stations in India is still under tender and has not been fully redeveloped or beautified. So therefore, the idea is you can visibly change certain stations where the volume is less. But when it comes to the idea of how the New Delhi railway station will go forward, you are actually not pushing in anything. So therefore, this is a paradox that you are beautifying stations where the volume of passengers is less, but the most important station you are not developing amenities. Last is this issue. In India, we have close to 5,000 locomotives worth 30,000 crores, which run on diesel. Now the question is, with 100% electrification, what will happen to these 5,000 diesel locomotives is a question. What will you use them for? But rather, I will ask you a more interesting question. Just by saying that I have electrified the railway station or I have electrified the tracks or there is electrification of a sector, can I say that it is a green sector? Yes or no? Locomotive means train engine. Train engine means locomotive. Can I say by just electrifying the tracks and electrifying the, you can say, railway station, can I say that it is a green project? You're saying no. The reason is what? The reason is what? Why no? Why can't we say that by 100% electrification, we get 100% green, you can say, railways? You're writing no. I want the answer to this question. Why am I saying no? Coal? Very good. Very good. Very good. Very good. Where does that electricity come from is important. If I'm getting the electricity from thermal power plants and then using that electricity in trains, then that is not a green project, because my generation of electricity is from a fossil fuel based understanding. This is the same issue with EVs today in India, that we have electric cars, but the electricity we push into those electric cars is generated through fossil fuels. Until and unless the railways develops, for example, a nuclear power plant or solar power plants or hydroelectricity, any form of renewable energy plus nuclear, if they use this electricity, then I can say that it is a green project. Therefore, the idea which has been touted here, that with 100% electrification, thus the greenest railways in the world, is a null set. It is a null and void point. This is just a rhetorical point. This is a rhetorical point. Because we have 100% coverage of electricity, we are the greenest. That is not true, because where do you get the electricity from is more important. So therefore, the person who's involved, and this person has chose to be nameless, the person who's actually written this article, it just says, but the author is involved in the Vande Bharat project. The idea is very simple, that with these issues, with Kavach not getting any further expansion, with the concept of Amrit Bharat station redevelopment actually not happening where it should, and the 5,000 locomotives which will basically be idle around, and further, where do I get that electricity from? Is problematic. So therefore, when I get these 3 points, I automatically realize that there is subtext to this article, subtext to the budgetary allocation. If I go further, there is no mention of the Western Dedicated Freight Corridor. There is no mention of Mumbai-Ahmedabad High Speed, which is bullet train project. There is no mention of how the old coaches will be converted into Vande Bharat's coaches. Nothing whatsoever is talked about. Basically, the railway budget is more or less mute on most of the important projects which have been touted by the government as path-breaking in India. So therefore, no mention of, for example, the bullet train project between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. Further, the minister has argued that India is going to become the second largest freight, what we call as by tonnage, becoming the second largest freight transporter in the world. But looking at the number kilometers of railways and looking at the volume of what we call as tonnage which travels across India, it is nothing whatsoever. 16,000, what we call as 16,000 kilotons has been argued is going to be transported through the freight corridor. But again, nothing compared to how much trucks, flights, and the basic other forms of transportation are actually taking in that regard. So therefore, what the article says is, rather than giving us concrete, as one of you said, only paper-based words, they have not given us any concrete answers. And rather he says that there is a mention that India will build 7,000 kilometers of high-speed rail network supporting 250 kilometers per hour by 2047. No strategy is given, no vision is given, no direction is given. It is just random rhetoric. Now, therefore, what to do with this information? I divide this information into 2 parts, positive and negative. Cannot be purely negative because you want to work for the government of India. Cannot be purely positive because you are a critical IAS aspirant. So when I talk about the positives, one positive is the average added railway network, which is addition, which is happening. Second is electrification is happening 16 times higher than what it used to happen. Further, safety is something which the government is focusing on. This is the 3 things which have been talked about. But if I talk about the negatives, Kavach has no mention in the budget, no increase in the, you can say, kilometers being covered under Kavach. Second, electrification, problem is what will happen to the 500 locomotives, and the fossil fuel based electricity means it is not a green project. Further, no mention of the what we call as you can't just stick on the Amrit Bharat program, but if you want to talk about Amrit Bharat, if you want to talk about the bullet train, again no mention about these. And last but not the least, just one big concept of 7,000 kilometers with 250 kilometers per hour. We already know that Vande Bharat does not run at its highest speed for a very long time. It is only in between. For a certain stretch, it goes to 180 kilometers per hour. Mostly, it is at the same pace of a Shatabdi or Rajdhani, which is 120, 110. So, Vande Bharat project is flagship, but Vande Bharat project, how do we integrate other aspects is also not talked about, which is Okay, we have Vande Bharat trains. But what will we do with the old coaches, the ICF coaches as they're called? What about those rakes being converted into Vande Bharat? That is not again talked about. They have not talked about how there's a crisis with regards to reservation. They have not talked about the crisis which is happening when in 3A, 2A people are boarding trains without tickets. They're not talking about the aspect of how basically the volume of people traveling on a certain sector is more than the number of coaches which are there. They're not talking about what is the corruption which is happening at the lowest level. They're not talking about the delays which are happening in the trains as of right now. So Kavach would be the answer for safety, and the other aspects would be to run more trains or add more coaches, beautification, and what we call as modernization of only certain trains for which a ticket is for 4,000 rupees makes no sense whatsoever. Because then a person who can afford 4,000 to 5,000 rupees would rather travel in the same sector by a flight than to take a train. And they have also not taken into account the concept of surge pricing. Today, it is more expensive to travel from one sector to the other for 16 hours, which because of surge pricing, a 1A ticket or a 2AC ticket is reaching 8,000 to 9,000 rupees. And a flight ticket for the same sector is maximum 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 rupees, which takes only 2 to 3 hours to reach. So therefore, railways is going in a certain direction. This is the problem of a publicly funded railways, because the decision making is happening from a certain standpoint, which is also rhetorical, which is also politically motivated. And if you're bringing in new forms of systems, the idea is very simple. The idea is very simple. This article is not written by a random person. It very, very specifically mentions that the writer is the leader of the Vande Bharat project and an independent consultant. So this project is not from a random person, and therefore this is coming from within itself. Though you can't just talk about the negatives, but you have positives also, but you have to develop an understanding where you understand that there is a need for reform in the direction. Now, what do you do with this information? You do, or rather use this information in a question like this. The Indian Railway needs to rethink its strategy and direction of development. Discuss. Simple, straightforward question. Because it is asking you to rethink its strategy and its direction of development, you now need to have a little bit of what we call as better understanding. The way forward here is going to be push on Kavach, push on Vande Bharat. Whatever negative is there, make it into a positive spin. Meaning, whatever negative I've given you, you just convert it into positive. There should be more understanding with regards to Kavach. The electrification should happen with regards to non-renewable energy. Amrit Bharat program should actually focus on railway stations such as Deen Dayal Upadhyay or New Delhi railway station, Varanasi railway station, or for example, Kanpur or Lucknow, very big stations in that regard. Further, you should also talk about how safety, if it is a priority, we need to create a better understanding. This is basically the idea. Way forward is always negative, make it into positive, it becomes a way forward. Okay. I hope we are all on the same page. Can I move to the second article? Again, something related to the budget and now urban development. Yes, sir? Okay. Now, the second article, again coming from text and context, deals with the budgetary allocation to the urban development understanding. So, Ministry of Urban Development, and there are multiple projects which we talk about. For example, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban, we have Smart Cities Mission, we have multiple important concepts which are linked to urbanization. Now, the article argues, again written by a former deputy mayor of Shimla and member of the Kerala Urban Commission. So, he's not a random person, not an expert, but rather a person who's involved in these things. The idea is, with 67% of the GDP of India coming from cities, cities need to be a focus for the government. And if they are a focus for Viksit Bharat, there are again multiple anomalies which are there. So again, I will develop the negative and the positive, and we'll try to understand how the negative and the positive sit with one another. So when we talk about, for example, the budgetary allocation, there is a lot of interesting aspects which automatically come out. So we start with the negative here rather than the positive. See, the budget has outlaid 96,000 crores for urban development, and this is higher than the last budgetary proposal, which was 82,000 crores. However, if I adjust this for inflation, then it is actually lower than last year. So I hope by now you understand this concept, that what is the real and the nominal matters. So here 96,000 crores, if adjusted for what we today call as inflation, this amount will go lower or will be adjusted and is actually becoming less than what we saw last year. So one thing is very clear, in real terms, the allocation of the money is lower than what we saw last year. First, this is the first negative which we can understand. Then, if I go through the budget a little bit in detail, you will see there are 2 to 3 words which are written, which is, for example, written budgetary estimate. It would be BE. Then it would be actuals. Then it would be RE, which is called revised estimate, budgetary estimate, actual. Meaning the budget estimated something. Revised estimate is that the finance ministry over the year realizes that the same amount of money is not pushed in, and actual is how much actual money goes through. So every budget actually has a budgetary understanding of the past 3 years, the revised estimate for the last 1 year and the actuals for the past 2 years. Therefore, if I look at the revised estimate of the Urban Development Ministry, I will realize that when 82,000 crores was allocated, the real amount of money which was spent was only 63,000 crores. And this means that 22.9% utilization of money did not happen. 22.9% utilization did not happen. Now tell me one thing. When you have a surplus, it can be only for 2 reasons. One, that you did not need to develop further, or there was no way to spend that money, or there was either overestimation, or the idea was that there was no political will or no plan to spend that money properly. I think we all can consent that India still needs to develop further. India still needs urbanization. So the first case is not there, that everything is already urban. So where should I use the money of 22.9%? So therefore, it has to be the second one, which is they allocated 82,000 crores, but they did not know how to spend that 82,000 crores, or they did not spend the 82,000 crores, or did not want to spend those 82,000 crores. Now the question is, if there's a deficit of 22%, which scheme did not actually utilize its budgetary allocation? And that comes out to be a very critical scheme, which is called as Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban. This had been allocated 30,000 crores, but only used 13,000 crores, which means that Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban, through which poor people under the economically weaker section, below poverty line section, based on certain criteria, get pakka houses from the government, there was a deficit of 22,000 crores. I don't think that the poor in India already live in a pakka house. Therefore, this is where there's a drastic, you can say, cut or no way to actually put in a plan where Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban could be put into place. This is where there's a gap between policy and implementation. So if this was a budgetary outlay which was not used in the Smart Cities mission, I would have understood that. This means that the people who need these houses, they were not given houses. And this in turn has an impact on the socio-economic development of India. This in turn has an impact on human resource. This in turn has an impact on the demographic dividend, everything else. Therefore, just because Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana was not, you can say, implemented to its potential, there was a human resource cost, there was a socio-economic cost, which is not taken into account here. So let's be very honest, if Railways is reeling under the concept of not getting enough money, Ministry of Culture is not getting enough money, if the Ministry of Rural Development is not getting enough money, we have this on the other spectrum where there's a lot of money which has been allocated, but they are not using that money. Now, budgetary this deficit or this underutilization, we have to go a little bit further, meaning which body did not get money, meaning we now know that revised estimate tells us that 22% deficit is there, 22% deficit in allocation was there. Basically, the money was there with the ministry, but they did not allocate it to a certain body. This is where the article says, how do we understand this reduction? If you want to understand this reduction, it is very simple. There are three types of schemes or three types of ways in which the Ministry of Urban Development is going to use this money. Either it can allocate this money to an urban local body, municipal corporation. Either it will allocate this money to what is called as a central sector scheme, which is, or it can then send money into what is called as a centrally sponsored scheme. There are three types: urban local bodies, centrally sponsored scheme, central sector scheme. The difference between central sector and centrally sponsored is, in a centrally sponsored scheme, there will be what we call as sharing, either sharing between the center and state or the center, state and the urban local body. This can be 60-40, this can be 50-50, this can be 90-10, this can be in any ratio as decided by the ministry in that regard. A central sector scheme is where 100% allocation is from the center. Basically, a central sector scheme is one where all the money comes from the center. A centrally sponsored scheme, as it says in its words itself, is sponsored by the center to either 50, 40, 60, 90% of the money coming from the center. Urban local bodies are important because they are the ones who actually utilize this money in that regard. Now, the first issue which has been pointed out by the author is that the reduction which happened was actually in allocating it to the urban local bodies, meaning the direct transfer of money from the ministry to the urban local bodies was less, which already is problematic because with the coming up of GST, urban local bodies, urban, you can say municipal corporations, already have a deficit of 21%, meaning 21% reduction in their taxes or tax driven income because of coming of GST. And thereafter further less money was allocated to the urban local bodies, which in turn creates a cascading effect. They are already in a shortfall. They do not have more money. They do not have a way to generate taxes. And in that regard, now they are under a burden of less allocation of money, plus a certain income taken away from them, plus the concept that urban local bodies don't take into account what is happening on the ground, and therefore now you have municipal corporations who have less money, money allocated is lower, no way to make sure that the deficit is, you can say, fulfilled, and they are now basically not interested. Now, if you think of it like this, if your municipal corporation is not working it to its total potential, it impacts you and me, because then sewage, drainage, cleanliness, everything will get affected. So where they reduced was the direct transfer to ULBs, which is again problematic. So they reduced and they did not utilize that money, but they did not give it to the ULBs also, who actually were in need of this money. Further, if I go to the central sponsored scheme, which is union, state and local bodies coming together. For example, Swachh Bharat Mission, Atal Mission on Rejuvenation and Urban Transformation, or be it Smart Cities Mission, or be it Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban. If the budgetary allocation is lower, it means that they are not fulfilling their purpose only. it cannot be that in India, with the amount of poor and lower sections and vulnerable sections we have, the concept is when money is already allocated on the budget, why is there no utilization? And there are certain bodies which are asking for that money. And in all of these schemes, these are very, very important for you and me, because this makes our city better. This gives land, or rather it gives a pakka house to an urban poor. It gives a better, you can say, amenities to us through the Swachh Bharat mission or through the concept of smart cities mission. So budgetary allocation, again here, the idea is, why did it happen? You have to go a step further and understand that urban local bodies are now basically having no incentive to use this money in that regard. So we have 56% money less allocated. And I think if you are from accounting, you would know one thing more. If I am given 100 rupees and I don't use the amount, next year will the ministry again give me 100 rupees if I only use 70 rupees? What is the answer to that? If you know basic accounting principles, if you gave me 100 rupees, I only utilize. We are back. We are back. Class is moving. Now properly sorted? Can you confirm that to me? Am I sorted now? Can you hear me and can you see me? Yeah. Yes, sir. Okay. Yes, sir. Great. Great. So this was basically YouTube server. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Coming back to what I was saying, that the question which I asked you was that if there is a lower budgetary allocation, meaning if I've allocated 100 rupees to you and you use only 70 rupees, what it will actually mean is that you will then be allocated only 70 rupees. And if that is the case, then next year again you will underutilize. So therefore, underutilization of funds is not a good thing. So therefore, if we are seeing in central sponsored scheme underutilization, it will in turn then again lead to a cycle of further budgetary cuts. So if I talk about the two major schemes, which is the two major ways to actually use that money, urban local bodies and centrally sponsored scheme, we are seeing negatives. So what I've established till this point through this discussion is the government of India allocated an X amount to the Ministry of Urban Affairs. The Ministry of Urban Affairs did not use all of that money. 22.9% of that money was underutilized. Therefore, in turn, with underutilization, there would be a case that where did the money did not go? And therein lies the idea. That urban local bodies and central sponsored schemes were the places where the government did not allocate that money. So this has been now established properly. Is there any positive in this? Yes. There is something which is positive, and that is in central sector scheme. In central sector scheme, a lot of money was allocated to rapid transport systems and metros, which is basically from 24,000 crores to 31,000 crores. The government is pushing for more and more rapid development with regards to transportation within cities, and metro rail projects are getting a lot of money. Now, the focus is on capital intensive development, not on socio-cultural development. Now, let me systematize everything for you the way we did last time for railways. Now, when we talk about these two aspects, positive and negative, positive is metro rail projects. Further, the concept of rapid transport projects. Both have got a lot of allocation and in a way were purely a important space in which the government of India wanted to concentrate on. These are capital intensive sector. Mostly central sector schemes were the ones which were in the positive. When we talk about the negative, central sponsored schemes and urban local bodies, there is underutilization. The central sponsored schemes are not getting the money which they should. Urban local bodies are also not purely, or you can say their taxation capacity has been reduced because of GST and they are being given less money. Therefore, on the ground, socio and economic programs which can help in going forward are not getting money, and therefore Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana urban not getting money is not a good thing. I hope this makes sense to you. If it does, you can see a question like this. The role of urban local bodies should not be diluted systemically via budgetary allocation and GST. Very simple, straightforward question, but an interesting one. Basically based on the idea that how do we understand the urban local bodies as a very important pivot in the larger understanding of our what we call as budget, development, and using our demographic potential to become what we want to become. Are we sorted with regards to this? Yes? Can I move forward? Okay, great. I have your comments here. I'm just looking at them. Yes, perfect. Thank you, Priyadarshini. Let's move forward. So we had two articles, one based on the railways, the other one based on the concept of urban development, both telling us that the government of India is holding back on something. That should not be the case. Okay, moving on. This editorial is very well timed in that regard because we are having what is called as an AI Action Summit in Paris as we speak on 10th and 11th of February. And therefore, it becomes important in order to understand what are the issues which India is going to do or push vis-a-vis as a co-chair. So basically, India had agreed France's invitation and we are now a co-chair in the AI Action Summit. And the previous summit which happened in the UK and then in South Korea, this one is important because India is playing a very important role as being a, you can say, player, or you can say a certain stakeholder in the forefront itself. And this is where this article says India has an opportunity to push three important concepts. Now, these three important concepts are important because they tell you how the AI space is developing and how we should understand the AI space. So, the first area which this article points out India should push, should focus in this summit today and then tomorrow is democratization of the AI space, wherein access to data set, the technology, the servers is something which India should talk about. Basically, India should talk about how there should be equitable access to the technology which is transforming everything. Therefore, the foundational models which are used should also be taken into account. And therefore, democratization of AI is important because everybody should have a certain stake, and in a way, everybody is a stakeholder. Therefore, certain countries holding this technology is not good. Though this is very far-fetched with regards to the idea of what we today call as self-interest and how countries are looking inwards. But the concept is democratization of AI space is something which he is arguing for. The second concept is more interesting and more realistic, which is AI now should be developed with frameworks which are relevant for the global south. Global south is a word which is used for third world countries or developing countries. Global south, frameworks which help the global south. What do I mean by that is, for example, if AI is trying to develop, you can say, visual engines or develop software models wherein, or platforms wherein it's only about input output, or it's about producing new video content, that is useless to a developing country. Rather, agriculture, climate, employment, areas which are relevant for the global south, they should be taken into account. Basically, local needs need to be taken into account. AI as of right now is sitting on a certain ivory tower, and when they are sitting on a certain ivory tower, they are actually not understanding what is the need of the world. Not everybody needs ChatGPT, so not everybody needs DeepSeek. You need to use AI in a more democratic manner, but also in a manner which is helpful to nations which are reeling under problems such as climate change, such as global warming, or any other issue which is specific to that area. So AI models also have to become more and more, you can say, relevant to the world, rather just being input-output gimmicks. The third aspect which is talked about is again interesting, which is contextualizing AI for the global south with regards to risk mitigation. Meaning, if AI can be used for mitigating risk of disasters, of hazards, or mitigating the concept of, for example, what we today call as disaster risk reduction, that is where AI may be useful. The idea which is being pushed in is very simple. Artificial intelligence is the future. I think we all can agree that. As of right now, we have narrow AI, which is input-output based, but we are using them for mostly needs which are very specific to a specific class or section of the world. If AI has to become what it should be, it has to be democratized, accessibility needs to increase, it has to also be, in a way, contextualized and developed with region-specific understanding. For a person sitting in Africa, ChatGPT is useless. Rather, if the disaster risk reduction can happen or local weather patterns can be understood better with AI, that may be the real use of AI in that regard. And this is what this article also points out, that India has an opportunity to talk about this in the global south, and or rather represent the global south in the AI Action Summit, and maybe this will allow democratization and more access to AI models. How do we get a question on this? Very simple. The development of AI and its direction needs to be contextualized for the global south. Very simple question. Cannot answer it until unless you don't know what we have done in this session. If you know what we've done in this session, then it will make sense. But if you don't understand what we've done in this session, or if you don't know what we've discussed this will become a very, very difficult question. Very difficult question if you actually look at it, because democratization, contextualization, and the concept of local needs have to be written here. That is why reading the newspaper sometimes becomes important. So we have now discussed the three big major topics. One, railways, the other, urban development, third, the concept of AI Action Summit, and what are the three key words: contextualization, the concept of democratization, and the local needs being taken into account. Are we all on the same page with regards to this? If we are, way forward is just talk about these three things. If we are sorted, then we go into the three simple, straightforward topics. Now just prelims oriented in that regard with a little bit of depth. Yes? Great. Perfect. Okay. Now, we all know that the US has recently pushed in tariff on multiple countries. China, Mexico, and Canada are the three major partners, which it is pushed 25%, 25%, 10% on what we call as 25%, 25% on Canada and Mexico, 10% on China, 10% on Canadian energy. Now, this move needs to be contextualized, meaning if I put tariff barriers on Nepal, if I put tariff barriers on Bhutan, it makes sense. Or it could be rhetorical, it could be a punitive action. As we already know, this is weaponization of tariffs, and this is the concept of punishing a country, bring them to the negotiating table through tariffs. But as we also know that with tariffs will come a trade war, and with trade war will come retaliatory tariffs, which for example 15% China has applied on American imports, and China can do anything with regards to its national security. Now, what actually makes no sense is that if I look at the data, 18% of all imports which happen into America are coming from China, 14% from Mexico, and 13% from Canada. Meaning these are the first three or the biggest three exporters to America, and America actually critical machinery and critical sectors import from these countries. This only means one thing, that Trump does not know the ground reality. Because if any of these countries retaliate, a point which I made yesterday also, there will be trade war, and only the Americans are to actually be impacted by it, because their basic amenities will start to increase in cost. Now, what I've said actually makes sense. Okay, I have something to say. Now I need to substantiate on it. And this data point article actually substantiates. If I look at the top 15 imported items into America, top 15, electrical machinery, vehicles, nuclear machinery, mineral products, machinery, pharmaceutical, surgical, apparel, precious stones, furniture, plastics. Look at this, 14% of all imports is electrical machinery, 10% is vehicles, 8% is mineral products, and 5% is pharmaceutical and surgical instruments, which means this is a very critical import which happens into America. Now, if I have a critical import like this, I would never try to be too over smart with that country which sends me this. But if I look at that data, top exporter of electrical machinery and equipment to the US, China, 33%. Top exporter of vehicles and related parts to the US, Mexico, 32%. Top exporter of nuclear machinery, China, 27%. Top minerals exporter to the US, Canada. Top exporter of mechanical applications, China. Pharmaceutical, Ireland, does not matter to us. Top exporter of apparels, China. Top exporter of surgical instruments, Mexico. And top exporter of precious stones, India. Now, this is where Trump either is drunk when he's doing these things, because in most of the cases, it is either Canada, Mexico, or China which is importing into America these critical equipment and critical aspects of the sectors in which they are a forerunner in. Therefore, if any of these countries retaliate via tariffs or stop imports itself, it will basically create a deadlock between these countries and in turn destroy the American economy itself. Imagine China is giving them electrical equipment, they stop that. Then Mexico is the second, both stop it. Vehicles, Mexico, Canada, both stop. Exporter of nuclear, China, Mexico. In every configuration, two of these countries are there. So if they actually come together and say, yes, it will harm them also, because their exports will fall, but it can be that we go into a certain zone where this also becomes viable. The idea is very simple. If America was doing this knowing that they had substitutes for these things, it would have made sense. American economy is mostly based on 15, rather 18, 14 and 13% of Canadian, Mexican or Chinese goods. Therefore, if you get a question like this, Trump's America First policy does not take into account the dependence of America on China. Elucidate. This is a question which you can answer through this data. It is actually a dumbfounded concept that you talk about America first, but then you don't have the capacity to actually develop yourself independent of these actors. Therefore, a tariff war will actually be more detrimental to the Americans than actually help them. And this is where, if the Hindu has all of this data, most probably Trump would also have all of this data. But the idea is, it's all based on perception, rhetoric, and the idea of how I'm going to create a global spectacle. That is the idea here. So I hope that you understand the importance of this data. Don't have to learn the percentages, but you should just have a basic idea that China, Mexico, and Canada in most of the critical sectors are the three most important. Canada, Mexico, China, Mexico, thereafter China, Vietnam, China, Switzerland, Mexico, China. So mostly everywhere there is either Mexico or China, Mexico or China. So I leave Trump to decide how he uses this data to change his policy. But the idea is, as UPSC aspirants, we have an understanding that actually China is extremely important for American economy and most of its equipment. Moving on. I hope this is sorted. Everyone, can I get an assertion? We all are on the same page with regards to this? Great. Perfect. Now, after 2 years of mismanagement of Manipur, Manipur's ethnic violence, the Kuki-Meti violence, and recently with regards to his derogatory, you can say a sound clip came through in which he was most probably 93% matched to his voice only. He was talking in a very derogatory sense about the minorities, and gross mismanagement, pure mismanagement of this whole episode where stakeholders and everybody should have been brought in. The CM has a very important role in making sure that these kinds of, you can say, historical but also sometimes engineered understanding of what we call as hate can be stopped by just bringing everybody to the table. That was not done. And finally, he has given his resignation once he realized that there was a no confidence motion coming through in the assembly itself, and only 10 to 15 of his MPs were standing with him. Now, most probably Manipur will go into president's rule, though that has not been decided as of right now. BJP government was there. If no one else is going to come through, then the governor, recently appointed Ajay Kumar Bhalla, is now going to then either go for president's rule. This was not a necessary activity. This was not a necessity, but the way it has been managed now, it necessitates a certain presidential rule so that the center can intervene and change the course of this violence or understanding in that regard. This is just an update. We had a whole session on the concept of Manipur. If you've not gone through that, just check on our platform. There's a podcast in which all of us were discussing what are the historical, economic, IR, and what we call as political issues which entail the Manipur issue itself. But this is maybe 1 year, 1.5 years too late. But now the government has control. The center has always been arguing that we'll leave it to the CM. But the CM has mismanaged this whole sector properly and very well, you can say, deserved to resign in that regard. And therefore, we have finally the resignation. We'll keep on updating you on what is happening in Manipur. But this is the latest which has come through in that regard. I hope that you will note that also. Moving on. Again, something very interesting. When the 123 agreement was signed under Dr. Manmohan Singh, in India, nuclear power became a reality. However, in India, when nuclear power plants were being created, there were multiple actors which could have done it. You have Rosatom, which is a Russian company. You have Westinghouse, which is a American company. You also had a French actor. But except for Rosatom, Westinghouse or the French company never actually did any form of development because of a certain act. And that act is called Civil Liability for Nuclear Damages Act. I've discussed this previously also. When the NDA was in opposition, they hounded the UPA to say that you're selling off India to these companies. So therefore, based on the heated deliberation which happened in the parliament, when the Civil Liability for Nuclear Damages Act came through, the provision was that unlike the world where there is operational liability for nuclear disasters, where the operator is held liable for any form of issues with regards to the nuclear core and nuclear disaster, India is one of those countries which has supplier liability also. Meaning, if Toshiba, if for example, Westinghouse is creating a reactor, if because of some reason the reactor core fails and there's a nuclear disaster, as much as the Nuclear Power Corporation of India will be held liable, but also Westinghouse will be held liable, Toshiba will be held liable, and the other suppliers will be held liable for this disaster. This has been against the principle of civil nuclear liability across the world, but India was always proud of this understanding that we will not let you only give us operational liability, we will also talk about supplier liability. Now, just before the Prime Minister is going to Paris and Washington, specifically the US, and Trump has been talking about better cooperation with India on nuclear lines, the same NDA today is talking about diluting the Civil Liability of Nuclear Damages Act. Basically, they are going to push in an amendment which will, quote unquote, as the foreign minister has argued, quote unquote, no details, bring the Indian Act closer to the global standards and comply with the global liability regime, which I think you also understand means that they are going to just dilute this supplier liability concept and bring in the concept of operational liability, which again means that they are trying to appease the West, Westinghouse and others. Multiple projects of close to 6,000 megawatts is pending. If we want to use what are called as SMRs, recently again I discussed the concept of small nuclear reactors. These SMRs, small modules which can be used for 600 watt, 700 watt, if India wants to use it, there's a dilution. The irony of the story is the same opposition made the provision come through into the act, now is diluting it for the purpose of international appeasement of at least actors coming into India for nuclear. Is this a good thing? Only time will tell. What are the details of this? Again, is not known. Only when the Prime Minister comes back, we will get to know how and what are the sections which will be diluted. This is something which is going to be taught by us in multiple cases because there will be articles on this very soon. I am giving you a certain heads up that this is going to happen very, very soon. And therefore, the same provision of supplier liability will now become operational liability. Simple, straightforward topic, nothing out of the box. Details are awaited. We end the session on a very interesting note. In Bangalore, the Aero India, which is Asia's biggest air show, is going to now take place for the next 2 to 3 days. Now, there was a very interesting, you can say, just before it started yesterday itself, the Chief of Army Staff and the Chief of Air Staff, both batchmates from NDA, actually did a sortie in Tejas, which is a first for India itself, where the Army Chief and the Air Force Chief together did a sortie. But what is interesting is the Aero Show is becoming more and more interesting because of a very interesting aspect. Su-57, which is the 5th generation fighter of Russia, and F-35, which is the 5th generation of the Americans, F-35 Lightning II, both of them are going to be up of display and will actually take part in this Aero India, you can say, exercise, which is interesting. We have F-16s also. You must have seen reels and videos about it also. But these two equipments being in the same air show is very, very, very rare. 5th generation Russian fighter, 5th generation American fighter. Again, something which we will be covering in the next 2 to 3 days. But finally, this is a very important, you can say, moment for India, with Tejas also a part of it. It is showing Indian prowess, but also shows how India has balanced both these countries so well that in a way, both of them are coming together. This is a victory of India's balancing of Russia and America, both 5th generation fighters here. It's also a show of power to the Chinese and the Pakistanis. But the idea is very simple. This is happening in Bangalore. We will keep on updating on you, but look out for this aspect when you do. So, before I end this session, let me summarize everything for you. When we talk about the railways, we had positive and negatives. Positives, we're adding more railways year on year. We're electrifying them at 16 times higher the understanding. And we are also pushing in for safety. Negative, Kavach is not talked about. Further, there is also an issue of, is this electrification actually green? What about the 5,000 locomotives which run on diesel? And more than that, the push for how we will retrofit things and the details for the smaller, what we call as transitions, are not given about. The same is true for urban development. With regards to urban development, what we see is that urban development underutilization of funds is happening. Central sector schemes are sorted, but central sponsored scheme and the ULB transfer of money is not something which is happening properly, which is again a problem because there is a need for India to go forward with regards to urbanization. But if we are not using these funds, it is a potential not properly tapped in. Then we talked about the AI Action Summit, where India needs to talk about democratization, contextualization, and use of the global South's issues to talk about local use of AI. Thereafter, I showed you a very simple concept that the Trump tariffs are ill-founded, because if you look at the data itself, China and Mexico are the two most important trade partners of America itself, and that will in turn have a cascading effect on the economy. Aero show is happening in India, and last but not the least, we most probably are going to dilute the civil act on nuclear liability from supplier to operational in order to bring in Westinghouse and French nuclear suppliers into India. So on this note, I'll end this session. Thank you so much. Remember, at 7 p.m., Chetan sir is going to be discussing critical questions related to static IR. Conquer Prelims Part 2 starts today, and I hope you will be a part of it. Use the code IAS English to join our batch. That will attribute you to us. Thank you. Take care and bye-bye.